and thank you for having me. I've been in 3 cities over the last week, and this may be my favorite. I may need a handheld mic. This may be my favorite because I'm celebrating Diwali with all of you. So happy Diwali to your family and friends. As Jason mentioned, my name is Sheela Subramanian. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a vice president at Slack. And as Jason mentioned, I'm also a co-founder of Future Forum. Future Forum is a consortium. It's backed by Slack with founding partners like Boston Consulting Group, Miller Knoll, and Management Leadership for Tomorrow. And we came together in 2020 because we saw organizations make bigger changes than they ever thought were possible in how their employees worked. But most, because we were in crisis mode, simply did a lift and shift. They lifted existing norms, technologies, culture, and they shifted them into people's living rooms. We saw an opportunity to redesign work to become more flexible, inclusive, and connected. And we've been doing so over the last 2 years with research conducted quarterly of over 10,000 desk workers, as well as executive roundtables and working groups. Imagine a workplace that is flexible enough that people don't necessarily just have choice in where they work, but also how they work, where all employees feel like they belong and are included into the culture of the organization, and where all people feel connected to one another and to their managers, regardless of where they're located. Imagine a future where the conversation about leadership shifts from command and control to trust and transparency. We believe that future is here, it's possible, and today I'll walk you through a few ways we work with leaders to get there. So over the last 2 years, we have seen a fundamental shift in the way that people view the role of work in their lives. Prior to the pandemic, I'm a working mother, so much of the conversation was around work-life balance. How is my life going to fit into my work? And now, we're seeing increasingly the conversation is, how is my work gonna fit into my life? And we're increasingly seeing that in the trends around the workforce. Take the Great Resignation. What we see from data that we released last week is that 57% of desk workers are open to looking for a new job in the next year alone, 57%. Or take the She Session. What we're seeing increasingly is that women are leaving the workforce in droves or downshifting their careers at unprecedented rates. And we're particularly seeing that among senior leadership, women in senior leadership, where they're looking for new requirements in their job, and they're willing to walk if they don't get it. Or take quiet quitting. Interpret that phrase as you will, but the way that I look at it is that people don't necessarily want to sacrifice their health, their time with their family and friends, their contributions to their community in order to play the corporate game. In all of these trends, we're seeing a disconnect. So many people have redesigned their lives over the last 2 years, and now they're being asked to return back to how things used to be. And that's a problem. And so what we recommend moving forward is that leaders actually revert from returning, which we're seeing in increasing numbers, to redesigning, work to become more flexible, inclusive, and connected. And today, with my conversation with Jason, as well as in this presentation, I'll walk you through what that looks like. So much of the conversation about flexible work that you'll probably be hearing today is around hybrid work. How many days are you expecting your employees to come into the office? Every week, every month, every quarter? But flexibility is more than that, and we're seeing that in the data. It's about choice. It's about trusting your employees to do their best work and to live their lives. And with over 2 years of data, what we've seen is that flexibility is a core expectation among employees. It ranks second, only behind compensation, when it comes to determining job satisfaction. And sure, 80% of people want flexibility in where they work, but a whopping 94% of desk workers globally want flexibility in when they work. They want schedule flexibility. Now, before you look at me and you say, oh my gosh, how would that work? I need my team members to come together synchronously. What we see is that 2/3 of employees want flexibility within a framework. So what does that look like? Our friends at Dropbox call this a nonlinear workday. One way to achieve a nonlinear workday is to establish core teamwork hours. So returning back to how things used to be would be saying everybody needs to be online from 8 to 8 or 9 to 5 or whatever hours fit the needs of your culture. But what core teamwork hours do is they assign chunks of time where team members are expected to work synchronously for one-on-ones, team meetings, roundtables, whatever that might be. But outside of those teamwork hours, people are empowered to do work when works best for them. For example, for my team, our core teamwork hours are 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., Monday through Thursday, to accommodate different time zones. And at Slack, we dedicate Friday to Focus Fridays, to do focused work. And what we have found is that people are able to do their work more productively, as well as live richer, fuller lives. The pushback I oftentimes get when I talk about core work hours is, though, we have so many meetings. I'm in meetings all day. My calendar looks like a game of Tetris. That's a problem. And all research shows is that meetings are an issue in our corporate culture, and most are a waste of time. Early in the pandemic, our CEO, Stuart Butterfield, he declared calendar bankruptcy, where he deleted every recurring meeting on his calendar. He said, hey, most of these things are not necessarily needed anymore. Let's start again from the ground up. That signaling from execs is critical here. But what we also encourage leaders to do is adopt the 4D framework. If the meeting is to debate, discuss, decide something specific, or develop your employee, discuss, debate, decide, develop, keep the meeting. If it's a stand-up or a status check, bring it into your digital channels and do it asynchronously. And speaking of asynchronous work, here's a key opportunity to redesign how we work, and it's still very new to many of us. Take brainstorming as an example. I oftentimes get the question of, why I can't have my colleagues work flexibly, like I need them back in the office to brainstorm around the whiteboard. How do I do that? What our research shows, though, is that the best creativity and innovation comes from the diversity of the voices around the room. It's not necessarily the whiteboard or the table or the brainstorm, which oftentimes rewards the loudest voices in the room. Instead of the brainstorm, consider the brain right, where people come together asynchronously in a virtual whiteboard or in a Google Doc. They contribute their ideas, and then the job of the leader is to bring those ideas together and discuss a path forward. There's an opportunity for us to just really rethink how we work and continue to test these assumptions. But sadly, what we're seeing from the data is that 2/3 of desk workers actually don't have schedule flexibility, and they're nearly 3 times more likely to look for a new job in the next year compared to those who do. What we also see is that flexibility helps with inclusion and equity within an organization. From the data, what we've seen quarter after quarter is that women, employees of color, working parents, they all prefer flexibility. So why are we seeing such high levels of burnout? What we see from our research is that nearly half of employees feel the need to show that they're working to their managers and to one another on top of actually working. Think about that. You do your day-to-day job, and then you have to have that extra layer of presenteeism or live action role-playing around all the work that you're doing all the time. This always on behavior is burning people out. And what we're seeing, though, is that so much of that is driven by how they're being managed. Middle managers are struggling, and it shows from the data. Based on our research released last week, nearly half, 43% of middle managers claim to be burnt out. And they are the highest level of burnout compared to every level in the organization. They also have the lowest employee experience scores across the board, regardless of level in the organization. There's a big problem that's happening here, because stressed out managers then trickle down that stress to their teams, and it's showing in the data. Now, this is not my way of saying bring all your middle managers back into the office full-time. Yes, they can come back into the office, but not full-time. Rather, this is an opportunity for us to coach and invest in feedback for our middle managers. The most successful executives I've seen navigating this new way of working, they're not the ones setting the top-down policies met with increased resistance. Instead, they're being intentional about the principles, the behavioral guardrails that they'd like to see within the organization. As an example, a guardrail could be leaders need to set the tone from the top. Or it could be when we come together in person, it's for fostering connection and camaraderie. But from there, they get out of the way and they empower their managers to set team-level agreements. For my team, team-level agreements talk about our core team working hours. They talk about how we want to discuss and debate specific topics, how we want to communicate with one another, so we're not always on and feeling like we need to respond. And the most fulfilling part of my job as a leader is refreshing these team-level agreements once a quarter with my team, because we have honest, candid conversations on what's working and what's not, and people feel empowered to speak up. And last but not least, we need to skill managers to become empathetic coaches rather than gatekeepers. And a big part of that is how they're measuring success. I'm aging myself with this anecdote, but early in my career, I was lauded for always being on my BlackBerry and responding to messages at midnight, for being the first in, the last to leave. Those days need to end. Leaders need to be skilled and coached to focus on the outcomes, the results that people are creating within their organization, rather than those who are always online or the first in and the last to leave. It's also critical that we celebrate the managers who are doing this well and continue to give feedback and coaching to help people grow in this new environment. Now, another job of the manager is to foster connection and camaraderie, and I think you're going to be talking about that a lot today. And oftentimes, when we talk to executives, the three leading reasons why they want to return back to how things used to be, rather than redesign, is culture, connection, and productivity. So what I'll talk about here is culture and connection. And one thing that we see from our data is that going digital first, being flexible, doesn't mean that you're never in person. But what we also need to explore is why we want to bring people together. Because all these trends we're seeing in the market, they're a result of people asking why. But what we're seeing is an increased disconnect between non-executives and executives about why they want to bring people together. So collaboration is listed as the top reason among both executives and non-executives. But then from there, what we see is non-executives want to build camaraderie, they want to foster connection, they want to get to know each other better. Whereas executives bring up FaceTime with management, as well as in-person meetings as their reason for wanting to bring people together. And that disconnect is creating the resistance and tension we're seeing in the market today. So in order to foster connection, it's critical for leaders to, yes, use the office, use in-person gatherings as a way to build trust, a way for employees to get to know one another. But in rewriting their job description, leaders also need to realize that transparency and trust are a big expectation among employees moving forward. Our research shows that 60% of executives are not including their employee base as they're talking about future of work planning. And that shows when it comes to the disconnect that I just talked about. It's critical for leaders to get more comfortable talking to their employees, building that feedback loop, and also saying, I don't know, we're still figuring it out, or the hardest one I've seen yet is, I need your help. And last but not least, it's critical for leaders to continue to invest in digital tools to foster the connection, to build that trust and transparency. And the way that I've seen this work really well is by hosting digital AMAs, Ask Me Anythings, town halls, or even asynchronous all-hands meetings. There's so much opportunity for us to redesign how we work rather than return back to how things used to be. And as we enter this era of economic uncertainty, I believe that those who are going to lean into the change are going to have more productive as well as happier employees, as well as will win in the long term. I oftentimes get the question of why I left my job as an operating executive and started Future Forum and wrote a book along the way. Growing up as a latchkey kid, as a child of immigrants, I didn't see many people who were building their careers and their families in a way that was authentic to them. And over the last 2 years, I have felt a stronger sense of belonging, both as a leader, as well as a mother, wife, daughter, neighbor, auntie, than I ever have before. And it's my hope if we redesign work to become more flexible, inclusive, and connected, that others will feel the same as well. Thank you.
Sheela, thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Have a seat.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned before, we've got a few minutes now just to sort of talk candidly and explore this a little further. And do, you know, as we're going along here, think about some questions. I would like to hear from you guys as well and see what questions you might have for Sheela as we go along. So thank you so much for sharing, you know, Slack's journey there and your own journey and also what you're finding at the moment in this journey. But, you know, given what I'd really like to do is, you know, given you're of the Future Forum, can you just spend like 5 succinct minutes telling us exactly what's going to happen over the next 5 years so we can then just enjoy Palm Springs? Is that okay?
Yeah, we'll just wrap it up right now.
That would be really handy. I appreciate that. But no, look, Sheela, it seems like a really critical point right now in terms of how work is evolving. And, you know, we're all seeing the news articles coming out of just the macroeconomic stresses right now, and, you know, there's fears about us heading into a recession and what that might do to the job market, and might employers have more of an upper hand to sort of dictate more time back in the office? So is it kind of this critical point right now? How do you see how things are playing out right now in the next year or so?
We're at a very interesting point, macroeconomic trends as well as what we're seeing in terms of labor trends. But I firmly believe that the leaders who actually embrace the change that's around them, rather than trying to return back to how things used to be, they're the ones who are going to emerge stronger from this uncertainty. Because top talent is your competitive advantage. And listening to what your talent wants and needs is going to be critical for weathering the shift. Because hiring people, onboarding them, it's all very expensive. So I think this is the time for leaders to actually focus on retaining talent. And I think a good quote that I heard recently was, you can't hire adults and treat them like the children and expect this to all work out.
Right.
Like, it's time for us to start treating our employees like adults, like humans, and I think this is going to be an interesting conversation around how to actually do that.
I do want to swing back to that because that seems like the elephant in the room. It's just that you know, employers can't trust their employees, which is, you know, that's a huge issue. But I mean, I guess what are you seeing among organizations in general? Like in the book, I love how Stuart Butterfield, Slack CEO, says very early on in this, you know, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to completely redesign work in a way we've never imagined before. So I mean, that's a big sort of bold move to make as a leader. And do you see that generally amongst organizations in general right now? How do you feel? Because we see, again, you know, there's certain companies that want to play the hardball game of getting people back in and go back to what was normal before this.
Yeah, because this is really hard. Navigating change is really hard. Trying to figure out how to change the way you lead and communicate, it's difficult. And the 3 reasons where we're seeing resistance is leaders want to bring everyone back full time because of increased productivity, fostering connection, and also improving culture. But what we see from the data is that those who actually work flexibly have stronger connection to their managers as well as each other because they're operating with trust. They feel a stronger sense of connection to their leadership over the last 2 years, as well as a stronger sense of culture, and productivity has also gone up. So a lot of those reasons are because there's just general discomfort with this change, and many people want to go back to what was familiar in their careers rather than embracing this change. And I think that's understandable, but I also think this is an opportunity to redesign how we work, given what we're seeing in the market, and also increase expectation from employees. Now's the time for us to shift our mindsets in terms of like the power dynamic and shifting from command and control to actually trusting and being transparent with our employees.
Yeah, I love that line, switching from command and control. And it's funny, you know, you talk about this in the book about the naysayers, you know, well, what's going to happen to productivity if we don't have people in the office, or, you know, what's going to happen to culture? And then the questions that you pose are wonderful. It's like, well, how do you know it was actually good when we were in the office? You know, how do we know that people were as productive as they could be when we were there? It's just that we were used to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to point out to this audience as well that, like, it's not, going flexible does not mean you're never in person.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're never in the office. It's being more intentional about the why. I was talking to a big bank last week, and they are asking specific teams to come back twice a week. But they're being really intentional as to the why. One day a week is to foster connection and trust amongst the direct team, and the second day is to strengthen cross-functional bonds. And they encourage the in the office message rather than the out of the office message, because this is their time to actually have that personal connection rather than doing solo focused work. And so I think answering that why, being really intentional, and then structuring both the design of your office as well as the day of your employee goes a long way in answering that.
I also want to sort of, I mean, this came out in May.
It came out in May.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, it's basically 7 steps to help get organizations to think more flexibly and sort of adopt these emerging models. But I want to sort of compare back then to when it came out to right now. You mentioned the Pulse data came out last week. And something that really stuck out to me is, you know, the executive experience has declined in terms of there's a bit more burnout now.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by that? What was your reaction to that, given that there's so much change? Were you surprised?
You know, I can't say that I'm totally surprised by a lot of these trends and the burnout numbers, mainly because I think we've been stop and start so much over the last nearly 3 years, where it's when the pandemic hit, it was like, okay, this is going to be a little weird for 2 weeks. Oh, actually, it's going to be a month. Oh, maybe 6 months. And now here we are 2.5 years later.
Yeah.
And I think that there's been just a lot of shifting expectations. I think that's helped contribute to the burnout. I think it's also like the whole tension between people have redesigned their lives, and so much of how we work is still a retrofit of how things used to be. So that tension continues to also lead to the exhaustion. So one thing that I think has surprised me through all of this is how certain things like flexibility and where you work and when you work, it's remained constant for the last 18 months.
Yeah.
It's still a core expectation among employees. But executive burnout, like so much of that is because people's jobs have been rewritten, whether you're an executive or a middle manager. And it's about embracing like new ways of leading. And that's also a very difficult shift to make, because what has made you successful to date is not necessarily what's going to make you successful moving forward. And I think that's very daunting for many.
Yeah, do you think it's just it's kind of like a teething period that we have to get through as we adopt such radical change?
Yeah, you know, I think in many ways people are like, all right, are we done yet?
Yeah,
Is this what it's going to look like?
Yeah.
And like to your original question, we're in the middle of this crazy experiment. You know, I'm not going to necessarily say in 7 years we're going to be totally done, but I think this is going to be like a 5 to 7 year settling period that we're all working through, and we're in nearly year 3 of that. Mm-hmm. So I think that shifting from what is the like tops down policy, what's the answer going to be, to a mindset of experimentation, growth, is going to be really critical for many of you as you navigate the long term.
One of the things I think about is, you know, like you say, we're 3 years into this, and it feels quite long, but it's also quite new, right? It's, you know, we don't know. It's like many things. We don't know what the long-term effects of something are yet. So something I know I think about is, I guess, like digital fatigue. Yeah. I know I was just talking to one of our service provider reps yesterday, and they were saying, you know, the conversations I'm having with my clients, like video conferencing is great, but it feels much more transactional. So I guess, I mean, do you think about that in terms of the longevity of all this? Like, how do we prevent that kind of digital burnout? I know I don't like that. I find it sort of uninspiring in a way sometimes too, and it wears me out because it's not tangible, you know? So I guess, how do you guys deal with that, and how do you think about that moving forward?
Yeah, you know, I think so much of the conversation has been around, like, what are your personal boundaries? My challenge with the phrase boundaries, though, is that you're putting all of the burden on the employee. So much of culture and how we work together also needs to be in terms of how does an organization set its specific guardrails? So, you know, some of the guardrails that we have instituted at Slack and we've worked with other executives around is like, hey, so what are your core work hours? And if you are a night owl, I'm a night owl, like establish a norm of using scheduled send. So if I'm sending something, I'm an email or a message at 11 p.m., have a scheduled send for 9 a.m. the next day. But also model the behavior rather than working around the clock, model the behavior in your own day-to-day work. I think another thing is just playing with new ways of working. If one person dials in, everyone dials in. So they don't necessarily feel like they're left out if they're not in a specific conference room. And also maybe pick up your phone. You don't necessarily always have to be on Zoom or on Google Meet. Instead of a meeting where you're just sitting at your desk for an hour, encourage people to do a walking meeting. That doesn't mean that they're less productive. It actually means that they're probably going to be paying attention a lot more. So rather than saying like, hey, let's retrofit the meeting to a Zoom, experiment with new ways of working that balance well-being with productivity. And I think that you'll find that there's a lot of opportunity out there.
And yeah, and I like that you mentioned a few points there that I know a lot of leaders are playing around with here in terms of, it's all dial in, we're not having this mix, but I know there's conflicting opinions about that too, and we're going to be exploring that throughout the day today. It does come around kind of to the evolution of space. So, how do you see that space needing to sort of change moving forward? That's one of the huge questions that we're tackling here as well. What do you see that's working? That's cool.
Yeah. So I'm an extrovert. I actually love coming in and seeing people regularly. And what I have found work really well is when offices have been designed to foster social connection. And I recently visited Miller Knoll, one of our partners, last week in New York. And what I thought was really interesting is that they had built social commons, ways in which they could encourage people to come together and get to know each other better within the office space. They had also designed restorative spaces. After a long meeting, or if you're having a hard day, you had a space to actually just decompress and be human and have your own area for that. And so I think it's important for us to shift from solo-focused work and meeting space to actually thinking about work or the office as a studio, as a place for people to get together, to collaborate, to foster camaraderie, and also to have some individual time. And a big part of that is also just talking to your team leaders, to your employees, and figuring out like, why do they want to come together and what would make them build connection and camaraderie with one another within the space itself. So it's been really cool visiting different offices and seeing what's working and what's not. But I think gone are the days of the rows of desks for solo-focused work and more towards helping humans connect with one another.
Yeah, and there are certainly, I know there's a lot of great examples of experiments happening within this group, which is cool, and I'm sure everyone's talking about it amongst themselves. I guess, and you mentioned the rows of desks, I guess I'd like to zoom out then when it comes to space.
Yeah.
And one of the other big things that our community here is working through is, how do we reconcile our existing legacy real estate and workplace infrastructure with these emerging models? I was talking to someone here the other day. They've culled 2/3 of their real estate so far. But I guess there's a lot of real estate that exists out there at the moment. So how do we bring those two things together?
So is your question the real estate?
Well, I guess what do we do as we transition to more flexible, and we may not need as much space anymore in our portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to we're in the middle of this. We're still figuring it out, and so long-term planning is very hard right now. I empathize with a lot of that. I think it's critical to experiment with the space that you have and figure out how are people using it and measuring, like, all right, who's coming in, why are they coming in, and where are they getting the most value? I think it's also about talking to your team leaders in terms of why do you want to bring people together? I've been working with a lot of different companies when it comes to planning on-sites, because I believe that on-sites are the new off-sites in many ways, and how they're dedicating space towards building on-sites and times for teams to come together. So my advice would be, rather than saying like, this is what we need at this exact moment, trying to plan into the future, continue to experiment, get feedback along the way, and make decisions accordingly. Because the sentiment of the workforce they're changing very quickly. And so I think that planning today for 4 years from now is exceptionally challenging.
Yeah. And also it's getting used to the idea of change being constant,
Yes.
Moving into the future. Look, we've got I'm just cognizant of the time here. Do we have any questions from the audience? If you throw your hand up, I think we can get a microphone to you. And come on, guys. I'm just the lowly event producer. So, here we
You're not.
we've got a microphone. Just wait for the microphone so we make sure we capture the audio. Oh, sorry. We'll make it over here
You're next.
as well. Yeah.
Hi there. Obviously, a critical dependency to this is the capability of leaders, and I'm interested to hear just some general strategies or thoughts about that dynamic.
Oh, absolutely. What we're seeing is that executives, middle managers struggling because their jobs have been rewritten. So there are a few things that we have seen as an increased expectation among employees. The first I've mentioned is around transparency. And transparency, it's kind of a word that makes some people squirm a little bit. It doesn't mean like put all the information on the table and let everybody know everything. Instead, it's much more about getting feedback from your employees, as well as being a little bit more vulnerable and candid in terms of what you're experiencing. What we're seeing from our research, I mentioned this earlier, is that 60% of execs are actually not asking their employees what they want when it comes to future of work planning. And this ties back to the real estate question as well. So if you're a focus group of one, you're going to experience confirmation bias because your experience is divergent from the rest of your organization. So a big part is asking others what they think. I think the second is, rather than assuming that work is one size fits all and instituting top-down policies, we've seen resistance across a range of companies when it comes to that type of behavior. Instead, it's actually kind of relinquishing some of that control and empowering your middle managers to figure out what works best for them. So yes, being intentional, setting what are those principles, what is the behavior you'd like to see, but then getting out of the way. And I've seen that be really, really tough for most people, but it's something that's increasingly an expectation for employees. And I think last but not least, it's also thinking about the balance between digital tools as well as in-person gatherings within your organization, and figuring out what that optimization looks like across the team, hearing from your team leaders, and realizing that all of this is an experiment. That policy that you have today is no longer going to be totally relevant next year. So adopting that growth mindset, getting feedback, hearing from your team leads, your middle managers, and shaping what's next based on that. Certainty is no longer a factor when it comes to leadership today. And I think embracing that uncertainty is going to be a critical part of being successful.
Did I read in the Pulse report that there's like 60% of executives admit that they're not actually collaborating with the other, in terms of creating team level agreements, like they're not actually collaborating as much as they should be? Do you think that's a huge problem?
60% are not actually asking people what they want.
Right.
Or they're putting out a survey and they're not necessarily doing anything with it.
Right.
And that's what's leading to a lot of this discontent among employees. They're saying, this is what we want, this is what we're saying we want, but no one's listening. And this policy that's been rolled out assumes that my work is exactly the same as your work. Yeah. And we want more choice in terms of how we work. I mean, I think a broader thing that I'm seeing that I find to be interesting is that the resulting reaction is that nobody wants to work anymore. And so that's why we're hearing about things like quiet quitting. Mm-hmm. But it's not that nobody wants to work anymore. It's that people want more choice in how they work. And leaders need to abandon how they were successful and the behaviors they did as the only standard for how people will get promoted within the organization, and actually embrace these new ways of working.
I think we had some hands shoot up over here before. Yeah. Oh yeah.
This is awesome presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
I love the idea of these team level agreements. Can you talk more about like how big of a team, like what are the types of team level decisions you guys are making in those meetings?
Yes. So what we encourage is that team level agreements are created like basically below the CEO. So the executive creates like, these are my guardrails that I want to see, or these are my principles and guardrails I want to see within my organization. Now, team leaders figure out what works best for you against that. And we've seen team level agreements work for groups of 100, 200, and even groups of 4. Mainly because they require conversations around how we want to work together. What is our culture in terms of how we work? What's working and what's not? And so I would say that rather than optimizing for the size of the team, it's much more about like who's working together closely and who's working together, periodically, and setting expectations in terms of how they work. I was speaking to an executive last week, and they actually created team level agreements with their partners as well as with some of their clients, where they were saying, hey, like, usually, unless it's an emergency, we don't necessarily want to respond to emails after 6 p.m. How do you feel about that? Let's talk about it. And having that conversation actually then created a culture of like trust versus someone being disappointed because their expectations were not met a few months later. And so I think team level agreements are kind of the shell or the vessel for actually being intentional and having the conversation and leading with the like, all right, let's talk about this versus let's disappoint each other and then talk about it.
I think we had another question is here in the front. Yep.
I agree. This is a really great forum, great way to kick it off. Every organization of any scale has a website that says, this is our culture. And this is what we do. These are our values. What I'm hearing from you is really we're looking now to small teams to really interpret what that culture is. How is the C-suite going to adapt to that if the nature of corporate culture is now not necessarily a top-down kind of dictate?
Good question. I wish I could predict the future in terms of how this is all going to look a few years from now. I think it's critical for leaders to adapt to it, to say, all right, these are all cultural norms. This is our work. Why is the way that we put it. Like, this is why we work the way that we work. And this is the type of behavior we want to see. And they model that from the top. I think that's the hardest part, is modeling it. So I think the disconnect I'm seeing right now is that even as leaders say, hey, we're embracing hybrid work, they're still coming into the office every single day. Or they're saying, you need to come into the office. I don't necessarily want to do so. So there's a disconnect between a lot of these policies and mandates and the actions themselves. And so the action is the most important part. But then it's also, yes, empowering your team leaders and hearing from them along the way. And I think that C-suite leaders need to adapt. It's not even how are they going to adapt, they need to adapt because this is all linked to the Great Resignation as well. And what we see is that employees who don't necessarily feel like their leaders are being transparent with them, they're not necessarily listening to them, they're far more likely to leave their organization because they don't necessarily trust their leaders. And so this is not a executives versus non-executives battle. It's like we got to work together on this. And we also have to acknowledge that like a lot of this change is really difficult for many leaders, but they have to adapt and lean into this change rather than trying to go back to what made them successful in the first place. Because we're talking about the economy, like where the power lies, but there's still a labor shortage that's happening, and it's still very expensive to bring new employees on board. So if your top talent is your competitive advantage, lean into it, listen to them, trust them, rather than trying to control all their actions.
I think we have time for just one quick question, if anybody has something. Yeah, over there. Yeah, one more.
Hi, morning. So I'm just curious whether, I mean, we talk a lot about what do employees want now and the power shift, and we talk a lot about different levels within an organization from execs to middle managers. Curious if you're seeing generational trends, because even for in my team, what I'm finding is, different people at different ages or at different levels of experience in their lives are wanting different things, and it makes it a little challenging to come up with even the right guardrails in some instances. So I'm just curious if there's trends that you're seeing there.
Yes, we are definitely seeing trends, but what we're seeing consistently, so I'll talk about two trends. What we're seeing consistently across generations is that people want more choice in how they work. And specifically, people want more flexibility in when they work. And we see that regardless of what age group that they're in. But what we're seeing increasingly as well is that those who are burning out are middle managers, but they're also the youngest generation, dare I say, Gen Z, the people who are early in their careers and in the workforce. And so much of that is because they don't necessarily know how to do their jobs. And they're trying their best to figure out like how to navigate an organization, how to communicate with their boss, but they've never done this before. And I think this is an opportunity for leaders to also think about this new generation of employees. Yes, give them choice, but also give them mentorship and sponsorship. And figure out a structured way in person to make sure that they know how to do their job successfully and they know what good looks like. I think we're missing the mark oftentimes when we're saying like, this is the one size fits all policy. But to your point, like the youngest employees need to have a better sense of what good looks like. And they also need to have managers who are trained to support them in an effective way. And I think there was a lot of work to do on that front.
Wonderful. Sheila, I'm so sorry. We could do this for a lot longer, but thank you so much. Like these guys have echoed, you know, it's such a cool way to kick off WorkSpaces. Thank you so much,
Yes,
ladies and
for
gentlemen.
having
Sheela
me.
Subramanian.